Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing the most iconic haunted mansions of the Ozarks, Borderlands. But first, we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. So, what do you think may surprise people about the Borderlands mansions and hauntings?
I think, first of all, that there are as many mansions as there are within these borderlands. And of course, if we might happen to miss your favorite mansion, please let us know in the comments below. And as is the similar case with the Ozarks, some of these mansions might not fit your stereotyped perceptions of a mansion or a haunted mansion. Nonetheless, many of them do, particularly in our Borderlands search. And it really is this extraordinary story of elegance and frontier development, ghost stories, and more.
We will return to haunted mansions, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book, Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Absolutely. And as we kick this thing off, I know we need to talk a little bit about what makes a haunted mansion. But before we do that, I want to jump in immediately with just an overview of the McBride house in Oklahoma. I do need to check on my little ghost hunting dog. So yeah. All right. I'm ready whenever you are.
Yep. You wanted to talk about the McBride house?
Well, let's talk about, since we can do the thing. I think a little bit of an overview similar to last week.
Okay.
Well, no. Let's mix it up, because if people listen to it back to back,
yeah, it'll be too much the same.
The intros will be the same. So let's do the McBride house to get them interested, and then talk about some of the aspects of stereotype haunted mansions, opera paintings, Addams Family, that sort of thing, and then go on.
Okay.
All right. So I'm up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I have no idea once I've gone off script.
Yeah.
So one of the things, before we get into some of the aspects of what makes a haunted mansion, I want to jump into the McBride house in Oklahoma.
Okay. It is, and we're talking about the Fort Gibson area.
And this is, I have not been to the McBride house, but the reports that are coming along with it really look pretty extraordinary.
They do. Now, I have been by there. I have not been inside the McBride house. It literally sits across from Fort Gibson, the old fort.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I believe it is one of the first houses that was built in the area. And uh, it is a beautiful home and imposing, particularly in comparison to others in the area. Um, and I've heard stories, but nothing that I can confirm personally. Um, I know that
The stories, it is really, really interesting. Just jumping directly into some of the references on page 3 for our notes.
mhm.
Uh, my little sister was only 3 at the time, and she would cling to my mother and me and cry when we tried to leave her in a room alone. Walking down the hallway one day, I saw the bathroom door slam shut by itself. I hastily went inside to see if it was really empty because I did not see anyone enter. I fully expected to see another family member inside, but I was the only person in the bathroom. Just to double check, I slowly walked over to the shower, a brave act for a 7-year-old. I grabbed the shower curtain and promptly pulled it back to look inside. Nothing was in the bathroom. The spirit began to get more aggressive as time went on. Several of the family members, including myself, were waking each morning with deep, long scratches on our bodies. At the same time, we began hearing heavy, whispery breathing throughout the house. The spirit was also opening the garage doors around midnight each evening. But the most alarming thing was the spirit was starting small fires in the kitchen. It would turn on the stove burners, and a pothole or some other flammable object next to them would soon go up in flames. One day, I could hear my uncle and mother discussing the ghost, so I knew that it was serious and that measures were being taken by my aunt and uncle to sell the house. And that is from The McBride House, Now You See It, Now You Don't by Cecilia Beck.
Yes, and actually, I do have that book, and it's a very candid portrayal of firsthand accounts, um, and not real. It's done in a way not to overly exaggerate claims. Um, it was not really written in the form of some books that were aimed at becoming bestsellers, in the horror genre or whatever. It came about. It came across much more as a matter of fact. This is what went on, and that I appreciated when I read it. It's been a number of years since I've read it, but um,
And I
and
appreciate that as well. And one of the things that we oftentimes deal with a lot of hauntings are things that are not as unsettling as some of these accounts.
exactly, um, and I think that I think it's good to have that balance because people they get inundated and desensitized by the bestseller aimed stories that often then are found out to have been exaggerated when they were portrayed, but this was not.
It is really fascinating. Now, as noted, the McBride house really does look like a haunted house.
It does. It has that look, and in person, as you go by it, you really have that feel of you feel stereotypical, but it's like you just feel like that has to be haunted. And it just seems to have a presence of its own. Not so much the feeling that sometimes you get that you're being stared at by someone, but it's to me it was almost like the house itself had a
Mm,
presence.
I get
Was
that. And that does
foreboding.
occasionally occur.
Mm-hmm.
It's The home was built by George McBride, who was a physician, in 1895. It is a Victorian home,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of things, some of which have actually been that really sound like stereotypical hauntings,
Mm-hmm.
uh, are included. Ghostly parties at 2 a.m., spirits calling family members and house guests by name, dolls that talk after the batteries have been removed. That's creepy.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Always.
experiencing impossibly bright lights, loud crashing noises, weird shrieks, and ominous smells of decaying matter. And the book Ghost of the McBride House: A True Haunting is also available on Amazon, and that's the book that you were referencing, I believe.
Yes, it is. And another thing that is mentioned is that there is a Victorian lady, and that she seems to go back and forth between the old hospital building on the fort grounds and the McBride house, which is virtually directly across the street from one another.
Interesting. And of course, Fort Gibson has a lot of historic hauntings.
It does, and a lot of history. I mean, the fort goes back to the early 1830s. Jefferson Davis was stationed there as his first appointment out of West Point, and just a lot of soldiers went through there. I've been told by park rangers that they have regular activity, people thinking that someone is in a building in period costume and they aren't, that kind of thing. But the stories that made the biggest impression on me were multiple rangers or park rangers saying that at times when they will have encampments there for reenactments, you will have phantom battle noises, and that on occasion they have had nighttime events, and you look out on the parade ground and you see what appears to be phantom campfires and so forth, as if there were an encampment.
That's amazing. And that which really does bring up the question if all of the hauntings associated with the McBride house are actually innate to the McBride house, or if it's part of the land.
I do have to wonder, particularly like the Victorian lady, because the woman they see in the house is identical to what is seen in the Army hospital, and they think that the rangers tell it that their impression is she is probably the wife of an officer who helped care for sick and injured at the hospital.
Very, very interesting. It's exciting. I want to see Fort Gibson. Now I want to see the McBride house as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
I want to go back to the fort, and I want to see the house as well. But
let's
again,
I am going to tether him outside.
Okay. Well, the McBride house is a good example of a Victorian era haunted house. And let's face it, that's the iconic image of what a haunted house is supposed to be.
It is, and as we discussed in a previous episode, but we're going to talk about again, because it is important. It is part of the imagery that is essentially built into our psyche as a society at this point, is that there are certain undeniable images of what makes a haunted house, and it is largely large, typically 3 to 4 story Victorian homes, oftentimes Second Empire style, Italianate style, homes with Victorian homes with mansard roofs and very tall, comparatively narrow windows with arched tops, and large porches, large deep porches. And it's really fascinating that these specific architectural styles or architectural motifs, when they're put together, even in a home that has been beautifully renovated and updated and it's restored, our knee-jerk response is to look at it and go, yeah, it's a haunted house.
Yes, but there are reasons for that. um, that we really aren't necessarily conscious of.
No, and it's I think it's I find the story of the haunted house maybe not equally fascinating to the haunted houses themselves, but still incredibly fascinating because it's a very emotional, it's a very human story, a very human
Mhm.
narrative of individuals who experienced more of a an emotional coming of age crisis and then moved on to remember these ostentatious homes as places of repression and foreboding on not on a paranormal level but on a personal level, and they imbued stories and art by the 1920s with this motif that then just so happened to work its way into public consciousness because this was the motif that was being used as shorthand for a lost and foreboding era or a highly repressive era, the Victorian era specifically, a
Mhm.
highly repressive era, and I think an era of lost dreams as well.
Right, and specifically coming out of World War One, um, you have young people who kind of look back at that Gilded Age as either, the older generation's problems, or the lost opportunities that they did not share in. Uh, Sometimes in a family line, even.
Very much
And
so.
yeah, and then you have World War One, which has unprecedented levels of violence and gratuity of violence and overkill between machine guns and mustard gas and trench warfare, uh, the lights that had not been seen at all since the American Civil War.
Mm.
And so their optimism was doused again, basically.
It was, and it was, it is hard, I believe, for us now um, to really take into account how existentially devastating these turns of events were for this generation.
Yeah, I think it is really hard to contemplate, but it's very, if you look at the artwork of the time, if you look at the literature of the time and into the 1920s, it does become very apparent. Um, yes, and
We're looking at you, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Um,
exactly.
the, the other aspect of this, and of course, my to me, this is particularly fascinating because my grandparents were born um, between 1907 and 1913,
Hmm.
and so they were children
Hmm.
at the time that this particular generation in question was mm, struggling with these issues.
Well, and ironically, my grandparents were born between 1892 and 1899. And I actually, one of my grandfathers was in World War One
Mhm.
and served in France. And so um, um, I can see part of that in things that I would hear from my grandmothers. One grandfather passed before I was born, the other when I was three, so I don't have a lot of memories there. But th- things that my grandmothers would say make sense when I look back at it in this context.
Mhm.
Um, on the flip side, I think that it it did create for some of them, particularly I can see in both my grandfathers, um, a sense of self-reliance that is hard to match these days.
That's very fair. And I suspect that the further west, comparatively speaking, in the middle of the United States, and this in what was in essence dying frontier,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of self-reliance.
There was, but I think those times really taught them the lesson of don't depend on what the larger societal narrative is. You really do have to figure it out for yourself.
And I think those are beautiful lessons to take with us
Mm-hmm.
in any age. And I'm still wrapping my head around the fact that the iconic Addams Family haunted mansion that we have grown up with since the 1950s, technically since the 1940s, but certainly on TV since the 1960s, that is quirky, eccentric, fun, creepy. You fill in the rest of the adjectives. And every Halloween, and I saved all of my cardboard Halloween placards that I got when I was a kid that has the iconic haunted mansion with the mansard robes, etc. That this particular image was literally born out of a generational cross divide and angst, as bad, if not actually much worse, than the anger and angst that, for example, we see between quote unquote boomers and millennials right now.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And also, I mean, you had a resurgence of spiritualism at the time too that probably played into out of the war experience, that probably played into the re-envisioning of the Gilded Age homes as spooky.
It did, and I'm going to steer us into three of my favorite haunted mansions, which aren't haunted, but definitely imbued a sense of a space within the American psyche, and that
Mm-hmm.
is the work that a Missourian did to essentially recast pop culture. Let's face it,
Mm-hmm.
Walt Disney redesigned pop culture beginning in the 1940s.
Yes, he did. There's no way to deny that.
Good, bad, and indifferently. Uh, it has mm, changed. I would say codified and um, and collated imagery
Mm-hmm.
for mass consumption and mass repurposing, because we absorb these images oftentimes as children without realizing it and then regurgitate them out. And the Disneyland, Walt Disney World, and Euro Disney haunted mansions, although they sometimes have slightly different names, uh, are all deeply imbued with this combination of a retrospective angst over the Gilded Age, with spiritualism, American spiritualism, and deeply imbued with a sense of really the paranormal or ghost culture seen through the lens of 1950s America, looking back to 1850s America.
Yeah. I mean, he incorporated all those factors, and then if you just to throw in a a Missouri connection, that a lot of those images used were actually taken from architecture in Missouri.
They were, and we're specifically referring. I'm a Disney theme park nerd. Don't tell anybody. We're specifically referring to Main Street, USA. I would challenge anyone to walk down the street in St. Charles, Missouri, and not say that Disney was not inspired by the basically the Civil War era to 1900 era age of architecture that you see in many small towns in Missouri, but is especially showcased at St. Charles. And it is very much like walking down Main Street, USA, except all of the buildings were not built in 1955 and 1972, respectively. And the ride, the attraction, Haunted Mansion's my favorite attraction. Go figure. Grew up riding the one in Disney World, in Walt Disney World in Florida, and I still find it really interesting homage because the Haunted Mansion architectural motif in Walt Disney World is tied to a late Revolutionary period, early American Hudson River mansion.
Yeah.
In terms of basically a colonial Dutch brick mansion. The Haunted Mansion in Disneyland, which is the original, is styled very carefully off of a mansion in New Orleans, which is appropriate because it's part of New Orleans Square. But the Haunted Mansion, which I believe has a slightly different name, but it's the Haunted Mansion in Euro Disney, is the classic American Gilded Age Victorian with mansard roofs, which interestingly enough was inherited from France, but is seen as a all-American haunted house.
Yeah.
And is very much in the line of the house from Psycho, as well as the Addams Family Mansion.
Yes. And it has become a shorthand that you see those images and you go, haunted.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And today, I mean, the first time that, was doing an interview with a couple of people for State of the Ozarks in 2007, and in relationship to Greenfield, Missouri, and their haunted house. And it was an unpretentious ranch home on the south side of town, not unlike the house I grew up in. And that was probably my first moment, on the ground moment of going, so technically I'm in a haunted house, in a house that was built in the 1960s and looks like the home I grew up in.
It happens.
It does. And just as a note on the paranormal, there are stereotypically haunted locations that in all actuality are not haunted. A number of cemeteries come to mind, or are not terribly haunted or noticeably haunted. There are locations that do really not look like they should be haunted that are. A couple of gas stations and fast food restaurants come to mind in terms of our past experience. Stay away from the soda machine.
Exactly.
But then, and of course, this is the topic for tonight, is these within Ozark, which is last week's episode, and our Borderlands episode, which is tonight, classically appearing haunted mansions that, guess what? Yes, they are haunted.
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes sometimes the two do overlap.
Which brings us back. We're still working in Borderlands of Oklahoma, to the Murrell home.
Yeah. And the Murrell home is really just barely in the Borderlands, because it's right along the edge of the Ozarks, because it's not far from Tahlequah. And it is pretty fascinating. It's a beautiful, beautiful home. I have not been there, but I've heard a lot about it. And it gets related to some other stories that we end up hearing about a lot in our lore. Basically, the home is in Park Hill, which, if I remember right, it's about, I think, about 15 miles from Tahlequah. I may be off just a little bit, but it's a mid 1800s home, and the Murals were related to the Ross family, and John Ross was one of the chiefs of the Cherokee tribe. And I love the fact that it is also referred to the hunter's home, because it literally was used for hunting trips, and has quite the story related to hunting, which I think is one of my favorites for tonight.
I can say that it is definitely one going to be in one of my top favorite stories for tonight. The situation of the family's hunting dogs on a trail, baying and barking, and presumably, I'm Lena, it's not impossible that it wasn't, a pack of southern foxhounds, not unlike Milo.
Very, very true. Very well could have been.
Which, for the record, both of our respective dogs, my American Basset Hound, your Foxhound, Southern Fox, exhibit a lot of presence of mind and sensitivity to spirits.
Yes, they both do.
And that's not uncommon among animals, but I have noticed certain situations where Milo and Sky, respectively, have really responded intelligently to situations, and thoughtfully and very presciently. And so I think and we should post photos of our ghost hunting dogs on Dark Ozarks. I just realized that. But
we ought to do that. We'll do that this week.
but the imagery of these these hunting dogs, these southern hunting dogs, barking and running, presumably chasing a raccoon, of course being followed by the hunters, and then all night, and then at dawn they finally catch up with the dogs, and the dogs have cornered not a raccoon, but what is described as a dwarf-like creature, and the dogs surrounded it, began to close in, and the being disappears.
Which, again, this would be the little people, which are prevalent in Cherokee lore as well as some other Native American lore, and very similar in aspects to Irish fairies.
Yes, think leprechaun, quite frankly.
Pretty much, not your Disney variety.
No, and it's honestly eerie, because in all fairness, based upon firsthand reports that you and I have both received, particularly from areas around northeast and eastern Oklahoma and the Borderlands region, these things happen.
They do, and some very detailed reports. There's another one that was not at the Mural House, but was on John Ross's estate, where they went out fox hunting and rode over a hill and encountered some little people, and the story went that John Ross told everyone to stop, and to not talk about it, and they all turned back and rode back to Ross's house, stopped the hunt. And the story goes was everyone was told, don't tell the story because it's bad luck to speak of the little people.
Yeah.
Obviously, if it happened, then someone talked because we know the story. But um, uh, so this story at the Morrell House is similar to that with the John Ross story. So it's not something that's isolated.
No, but I do find it really interesting that we have two little people stories associated with the same family line.
That's true. And of course, little people, are part of the Cherokee lore, so that would make sense. And I do just, I have wondered this question before: were the little people already here, or did they come with the Cherokee? I
Yes.
don't know.
Or some of each,
True.
but it does, it is really fascinating and something that is, this is a ponderable mystery, but we see this not dissimilar incidents with German and Irish immigrant families
That's
in,
true. That
in
is
settlement,
true.
and Scots Irish. We've
Hmm.
got, situations where the beings of the old world follow them to the new, and in this case, we may be looking at the beings of the Carolinas and Georgia and Tennessee following to Oklahoma and manifesting themselves here as well in the Ozarks.
Very, very possible. I almost kind of lean that direction as my sort of gut feeling.
And
Now, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, with other incidents with the mural house, doors opening and closing in rooms that are empty. Interestingly enough, the smell of bread baking or bacon frying in the kitchen.
I
Uh,
like those kind of hauntings.
I do too. I do too. I still contend, if I'm going to get my house haunted, I would like them to bake cookies
Hmm.
for reals. Just saying. Uh, and orbs being seen, black shadows on camera.
Now there is
Again,
also the story of the electrician
yes,
who was working upstairs and felt a hand on his shoulder, turns around and no one's there. And he ran out of the house and would not return, and actually sent someone else to go get his tools. And then sources say uh, accounts from someone who worked in the home that summer and verified that that happened. That so, and we have firsthand knowledge of similar kinds of experiences in other locations happening.
yes,
Um, and so it does, I mean, that does happen. It is noted that not only the little people stories, but shapeshifters are also part of the local heritage with the Cherokee, and that they are not necessarily scary. And I like the fact that they stated that
I did.
perhaps the little person disappearing in the hunter's story, is it just disappearing? Is it shape shifting into something else? We don't know. But there's just all of these things that can be happening, and maybe even account for some of the things they see on camera, things moving shadow wise. That to me, it just makes a lot more sense. We have scared ourselves silly in the media with anything shape shifting or anything like that is horribly scary or evil, etc. And I just don't think that's the case. all the
Agreed.
time.
And for the record, Hunter's Home or the Mural House is a part of the U.S. National Park Service. So
Yes, so you can visit it.
publicly visited.
Well, and of course, another thing there too is that during the Civil War, there was a lot of fighting in the area, a lot of buildings and homes destroyed, including at one point John Ross's home was destroyed, but Mural House did survive. One of the few actually to survive, and I think I've read somewhere that is the oldest surviving standing house in Oklahoma.
Wow. And it is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It is very, very beautiful. I want to visit it now. Sooner rather than later.
There's several places I would like us to check out in Oklahoma.
And for the record, some of the locations in tonight's episode we have been to. So
yes.
that brings us to the Belvedere Mansion in Claremore, Oklahoma.
Yes. Which is
beautiful.
gorgeous.
Oh my. Yeah. It is on the National Register of Historic Places.
Mm-hmm.
It is a 3-story mansion built by John M. Bayless starting in 1902.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he was something of a railroad magnate.
Yes, and direct Ozarks connections here because he before moving to Claremore, they lived in Cassville, Missouri, in Berry County, and I have been told that the Bayless home in Cassville is very haunted.
Interesting. We need to do more research. Cassville is an interesting place. We could do an entire episode on this region of immediately surrounding Cassville.
Yes, we could.
Which is not a bad idea. This, of course, the mansion, the Belvedere Mansion in Claymore, is a Victorian Gothic. It is brick, the tile roof. It is built to appear like a castle. It has 4 towers. Of course, space for the carriages. The floor is being covered in tile, wainscoted, marble walls, pressed tin ceilings, sliding pocket doors. I'm reminded of the Ball House. And interestingly enough, and I find this particularly, to me, this almost end of the Gilded Age, 6 degrees of separation in the West.
Yes.
coming back to this 1880s to 1900 new frontier aristocracy. That's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And the nouveau riche of the great American West, and much of the trim and the woodwork used to complete the Belvedere Mansion was purchased and brought from the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. Like several other places that we've discussed in prior episodes.
Yes, and a couple of important chunks of the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis ended up in Hollister. There was another important chunk of the 1904 World's Fair ended up in Alton, Illinois, not far from the McPike Mansion. It is really, really interesting to me because, again, there is culturally these deep tie-ins in terms of American psyche. Again, us inheriting ideas that are at this point have been inherited so many generations back. We don't know that we've inherited them. We just think their idea. It's not even an idea. It's just a substrate of culture. And these were concepts that were created through two World's Fairs, 1893 in Chicago and 1904 in St. Louis. And of course, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair directly impacted not only the psyche, but also great aspects of culture and industry in the Ozarks in the 20th century.
Very much so.
Lastly, and most importantly, with the 1904 World's Fair, it brought us frozen custard and waffle cones.
Yes. Can't forget that.
No. And I still contend that St. Louis has the best frozen custard I've ever had.
Ted Drews, we're looking at you.
just throwing down the gauntlet there. But with the Belvedere Mansion, there are a lot of paranormal associations with the mansion.
Yes, but I do want to mention sort of a note here. One thing is that Mr. Bayless would never see the completion of the house. He died before it was completed, following appendicitis. And but his wife Mary and 6 children did finish the mansion and live there. And then later it was sold to an investor who turned it into apartments, and we start seeing patterns in some of these Gothic homes that they end up sort of moldering and being hacked up into apartments, things like that, and then hope, at least in some cases, being brought back later to their glory. And I do wonder if that process is not also a factor in the hauntings.
I suspect it is. I really do. And we tend to associate, we look at, for example, a restored mansion or restored vintage home. We find out that there are stories of hauntings with it, and the mind immediately travels back to for example, the original builder, the family who built the home, or perhaps tragedies that took place when the home was functioning as it was originally designed. And It's very easy to overlook a huge gap of history, and oftentimes we see one of three or a combination of all three, of the mansion being converted into low rent apartments,
Mm-hmm.
The mansion being used as a nursing home,
Yes.
or the mansion being used as a funeral home, or some combination of all three.
Yes. Yeah, some of them have gone through all of those steps, unfortunately. But this is a situation that the Belvedere does seem to be a situation where the hauntings are sort of a combination of all of those factors. Claims include children playing upstairs, which certainly could be the family, but it could also be from the time that it was apartments. Also, encountering a distressed Mr. Bayless. And of course, he passed after appendicitis, so that's certainly possible. Plus, at the time of his death, he was building an opera house and an athletic club, as well as the mansion. And so I imagine that the man, it was just under a lot of stress anyway during that time period, so that may contribute to that. And then significantly, I do like the fact that it's not identified with the original family, of a young woman from the 1940s when it was apartments who committed suicide.
Yes. And all of these really speak to how hauntings can form.
Very true. Very true.
It is reminiscent to me. This is a digression to a haunted mansion that is in the Ozarks, but it is, all I will say is it's in Springfield. You and I've been there. It's in Springfield. It is not open for public tours, but it has an extraordinary number of hauntings associated with it. And the home was built in 1900. Beautiful mansion, built in 1900. And by the 1930s, it was a funeral home. And by the 1960s, it was low-rent apartments.
Yeah. There just seems to be that progression. And I do think that often that those steps are a factor in it. One thing that people encounter is hearing flushing toilets, and sometimes toilets that do flush on their own. Of course, we're assuming that plumbing issues are factored out of that, but that kind of activity is a fairly more regular occurrence than people probably associate, but it tends to, in my experience, happen in places with pretty intense hauntings where either toilets flush on their own or faucets turn on and off on their own, without explanation, or bring in plumbers and they say there's nothing wrong with it, or bathtubs as well. So something about running water, and of course we've talked before that running water does seem to have an association with hauntings often. And I kind of theorize that spirit using whatever energy it has to make water run is probably an exercise in creating more energy.
And that's a really good point. We oftentimes don't realize how much energy can be conveyed or even existent within water. We're so accustomed to it.
Exactly, especially moving water.
Yes. And
also hazy figures are seen. And it's speculated that some of them are part of the Bayless family and some of them are tenants from the apartments.
That can make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it also speaks to an interesting social strata of hauntings. When you see, for example, a mansion, and again, this is a not uncommon process. The mansion beginning, of course, very aristocratically. Often the builder of the mansion or someone associated with the mansion dies, sometimes even before the mansion is completed or shortly after it is completed and the family moves in. And then potentially, if you have traditional funeral home hauntings or low rent housing hauntings, these are individuals who are coming from a very different life background, and now in inhabiting the same space, but not necessarily the same plane, even with each other.
And I've seen situations where, in that case, different entities are aware of each other, and in other situations, they don't seem to be aware of each other at all.
Mm-hmm. And we did a investigation at a more public location in Springfield this winter, that we seem to be really encountering a very wide variety of hauntings, and the amount of which ones were aware of the other ones or even understood the other ones seemed to really be up in the air.
Yeah, it was almost like Chinese walls between them, that they were in their own almost little cubicles, so to speak, of time and space.
Yeah, it was, or that they might be vaguely aware. that
Almost as
thing.
if they're hearing a whisper from another room.
And that might have been, sometimes the whisper, the shadows might have been us, and
Yeah.
sometimes that might have been some of the other things that we were investigating. Something that's also interesting, just as a comparative tie-in with the location, I can't talk about its specific location in Springfield, is also very close, if not overlapping, on several of the battles, rather bloody battles that took place in Springfield during the Civil
True.
War.
That's true.
Which, is an interesting comparative tie with Fort Gibson and Washita, etc.
That's true, because you do have those crossovers, and that very well could be happening there. I hadn't even thought about that, but you're exactly right there.
And again, I think it's very important when you are doing research, paranormal research and investigation. We have the bad habit of thinking in a singular dimension, and it's much better to think in terms of multiple dimensions, and also think in terms of multiple layers.
Mm-hmm.
Will layer one on top of the other, and their perception of us may be as hazy in some cases as our perception is of them.
I have found that to make sense in a lot of hauntings.
Which really is important. And I say this tongue in cheek, but I actually mean it very seriously. When you do investigations, take considerable effort not to scare the ghosts.
I agree, because they are the residents.
Mm-hmm.
They were human beings. They are human spirits. And in a lot of cases, there seems to be free will and consciousness, at least on some level there. So, the golden rule really does apply.
It does, and I think it could be a little mind bending for individuals, because we are so stuck in this idea of ghosts are scary, ghosts are scary, ghosts are scary.
Mm-hmm.
The reality that from the spirit perspective, corporeal beings could be quite scary.
Especially if you're not aware of them per se, or I think sometimes it almost appears that in some cases, like, they hear the living but not see, or perhaps they do see some things but not get the whole picture, kind of like we do with them. And so it can be disconcerting on either side. You almost have to view it as them living in their time and space and getting a glimpse of us. So in that sense, what they experience is no different than what we're experiencing with them.
And encountering an investigation group could be a very startling and unsettling experience. Tread lightly and gently within the space, and speaking of treading gently, and actually moving over to borderlands of the Ozarks that are beautifully in my home state, we have the very haunted McPike Mansion of Alton, Illinois.
Yes, it is. It's a beautiful,
Yes.
beautiful home in a beautiful location. I mean, it's, up on the hill. I mean, it's beautiful.
It's exquisite, and Mr. McPike, who was contemporary of Abraham Lincoln, completed the home in 1869. It is up on the river bluff overlooking Alton, Illinois, and it's an exquisite Second Empire home, and if you include the extensive basement, there's 4 levels to the mansion, and just unbelievable. This is a mansion I have had the opportunity to tour privately, and it is an incredible experience. You can go to the McPike Mansion's website and find out. There are a number of times throughout the year when you can purchase tickets to tour the home in a formal, formal tours, particularly in autumn.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been it is being slowly and painstakingly restored by Sharon and George Lukey. And it is private property.
And they have owned it for
Since the late
quite a long time.
mid 90s.
Mhm.
Had the opportunity to interview Sharon earlier this year in person, and she gave a tour of the McPike Mansion, including the basement and the wine cellar. And it is an exquisite home. It was so cold. It was Olivia cold. Let's just say. But
Well, it's the time of year too, yeah.
I know. Yeah, I'm not talking like cold spots or anything. It was February. It was February up on the hill, and those incredibly tall ceilings and the cold. I was about frozen, but it is in speaking with the owner, with Sharon, it really is a beautiful um, perspective, not really segueing nicely off of our conversation about Don't Startle the Ghost. Sharon related to me that very early on after the purchase of the mansion, she would be working in there, and things would start happening. She would feel, you know, hand on the shoulder, hear her name being called, things being moved, noises that, inexplicable noises at odd times, etc. Just a lot of your stereotypical haunting situations. And Sharon admitted she's originally from the Chicago area. She was not someone who was versed in the paranormal. It wasn't her bailiwick, really, prior to this. But instead of being terrified or selling the mansion or any of that stuff, she started having conversations with the spirits and saying, I bought this place, we bought this place so that we can take care of it, so that we can restore it, so that it can be as beautiful as you all remember it. And if you keep interrupting and freaking me out, it is going to be hard to do that. So let's agree that we all love the mansion, and maybe help me out just a little bit by not doing anything too freaky. And she said that, the overall response on that was incredibly polite. She always makes a point of saying hello to the residents when she walks in. As
I like that.
as we do. As we do. And the home, now here's the funny thing. Of course, we a little over a year ago, we did a late night investigation at the Mineral Springs Hotel. Been in a number of locations. And as you noted, like the Mineral Springs Hotel, highly recommend visiting it. It can push back.
Yes, it can. Literally.
We found out. Here's the deal. Full confession on my part. When I drove by the McPike Mansion before interview time, just to make sure that I knew where it was, like a day early. So at the point that would actually go, and I just wanted to familiarize myself with the neighborhood and know where it was I was going so I wouldn't be late. And I honestly, this is full confession, drive by, the sun was setting, this imposing 3.5 story Second Empire 1869 dark mansion on top of the hill, surrounded by these huge trees in this big acreage. There is a point in the back of my mind that I drove by and went, oh hell no.
Oh, come on now.
Now, having actually gotten to tour it and interacted with the space, it is one of the most loving, peaceful, beautiful homes that I've ever been in. It reminds me of Kendrick House. It is, to me, the overall sensation and the energy and the vibration within the space is that the all the hauntings, and there are a number of hauntings associated with the home. The bulk of the hauntings being McPike family members, including Mr. McPike, because the home was in the McPike family for multiple generations, and the energy. At one point, I even found myself standing by myself in the middle of the wine cellar in the basement, in the dark.
Good.
And it is you could close your eyes and just see the love and light and beauty of the home. It is not fully restored at this point, but you close your eyes and you could feel it just around you. So it is a very, very hospitable, very beautiful place. Honestly, I believe that it is filled in terms of the residents, that they are lovely, and wonderful people who we get to briefly share the space with on occasion. Highly recommend visiting the McPike Mansion, and as is the case with um, many of these homes and locations. When you do have an opportunity to tour them, please do, because the funds that for small ticket purchases and that sort of thing do go to help with restoration.
Yes, and these tasks are extremely expensive. It's
Oh my
not
God.
it's not a nominal expense by
No.
any means.
No, I believe um for the original estimate on a well the I have to look at my notes. It's in the millions to fully
Oh,
restore Pike in current. So it's highly worth it. Plus, Alton as a town is just a fun town,
it is.
especially for eccentric paranormal enthusiasts.
Yes, a number
That
of places.
and I do want to conclude. This was before we done a lot of the research for these episodes, and I will be the first to admit I was succumbing to my pop culture programming with those mansard roofs and tall windows and lonely dark house on haunted hill vibe.
Uh-huh.
And I'm glad that of course I was going to anyway. I wasn't going to not, but again there was just that fleeting moment of going, yikes, zoinks, movie.
But fortunately you didn't.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't have. I'm too committed to my craft not to do that, but I will admit that it crossed my mind just briefly.
Fair.
Now,
Now we can wander west to the borderlands in Kansas.
all the way over to Kansas, not far from Caney, where we were in September for the Paracon.
Yeah, no, and in fact, this fall we'll probably go by the Brown Mansion.
Yes, and the Brown Mansion is in Coffeyville, Kansas. It was completed in 1904. Is a 3-story, 16-room mansion built at the time for the cost of $125,000, which gives you an idea of just how incredible this place is. I've not been there. It was built by W.P. Brown, who moved to Coffeyville from Ohio in 1890. Like I have not. I've been near the Brown Mansion. I was privy to some conversations with you all with SEK about Brown Mansion. I've not been there, but you have.
Yes. Well, I've been there. I have not investigated it, but I have been there. And actually, a number of years ago, I was at a Brown family auction there, where they auctioned off a large number of items from the family collection, and this is just what they were removing from collection, not what's there, and were just amazing antiques. But it is absolutely beautiful and very imposing. It was designed by Edward Wilder and Thomas White, who studied with Stanford White. And Stanford White was a very renowned architect in New York City in the early 1900s. That later ended up in a murder scandal, but was highly, highly regarded. And the home, to be perfectly honest, reminds you of the White House.
I was really recognizing that from the photos. We do encourage people to, and what is the status in terms of visiting the Brown?
It's you can visit. I would look at their website for the exact hours, but they're open regularly, and then and for tours, etc. They do not. The last I knew, they are not doing paranormal events anymore. They were, but some things happened, unfortunately, with a group that they have ceased that, at least for the time being. But certainly go on the tour and hear the stories. And again, this is part of this pattern that we have talked about of family, building wealth. In this case, with natural gas and lumber, but for all of that success, it did not bring luck for the family.
No, it did not. So the Browns had 3 children who survived birth. William, who only lived to the age of 4, Donald, who only lived to the age of 11, and then their sister Violet, who actually lived into old age and sold the mansion to the Coffeyville Historical Society.
Yes, but the Browns passed while they lived there, as well as Donald, and then basically it seems that they are pretty much all still there.
It very well could be. I mean, we have some visitors saying that they've seen the ghost of Violet in the 3rd floor bedroom. Others have said that they've seen Donald, the 11-year-old, playing on the 3rd floor. Some have said that they've seen the ghost of Nancy and WP, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, in the mansion, smelling pipe tobacco on the 1st floor dining room and library, which all of these are very common paranormal incidences. The ghost of the family's servant, Charlie, has been seen sitting in his basement bedroom and standing by the front door as if awaiting visitors. One of the anecdotal reports that I personally find to be the most eerie, the report that says that Coffeyville residents noted that during the years that the building was vacant and the power was off, they would occasionally see green glowing lights on the mansion's grounds.
And that's something that, happens in other locations as well. Those kind of stories that when the power's out or no one's around, that there will be lights or shadows of people in windows, things like that. So you do get that kind of activity. And I think that often when you see these sort of lights, particularly when it's not lit by a flash of a camera, that it's some sort of energy if it's self-illuminating, and not a bug. Certainly would,
Right.
I would assume it would have to be bigger than that for people to see it on the grounds, because it's fairly large property too. So
I'm looking forward to visiting.
yeah, it's gorgeous, and yeah, that's why I said, yeah, that we ought to do that while we're out that direction. So
and and we will.
mhm.
And we encourage you all to visit um, the mansion if you're out Kansas way, or if you're already in Kansas. And
And I think that's a good thing to note too, that for all of these houses that are open or offer tours, it really is important to go, because number of people going through the door as well as donations really do help confirm and continue to tell the story that these places are worth saving and preserving. And that's something that kind of gets lost sometimes, and then people complain when something is lost.
yeah,
But take advantage of the opportunities when they're there to help keep them there for the next 100 years or more.
agreed. When you see mansions being torn down, it's heartbreaking, but it is also a very important call to action, not just to in some cases to attempt to save locations, but make plans and actually go visit the ones that your tour dollars can help continue to maintain.
Exactly. And it's very cost effective recreation. I mean, it's
Oh yeah, yeah. So with that, turning to what is called by some to be the most haunted house, not just in the Ozarks region or Middle America, but theoretically the most haunted house in America. I leave that for people to debate in the comments below. Um,
yeah,
I'm not making that judgment call whatsoever, one way or the
me
other,
either.
but it is the Allen House in Monticello, Arkansas.
And I will tell you that I've not been there, but it is talked about quite a bit. And it does have a particularly salacious story to go along with it. And so I don't know whether the haunting is that intense or the story is that intense, or both.
And it really comes down to the Allen family, with you know associated with the mansion, and their daughter Liddell on Christmas of 1948 killing herself with cyanide.
Yes, I mean, very, very tragic, and lingered for 8 days.
Yes, and the later owners, Mark and Rebecca Spencer, would find 90 letters hidden in the house that connected Liddell with a secret and then failed relationship.
Hmm.
That
Liddell had a kind of a tragic, sort of a tragic story anyway, of failed, a failed marriage, and had lost her son. Her only son had died in his 20s, uh, just about, I think, 3 years earlier, 3 or 4 years earlier. And then she'd been involved with this man, and it appears that there have been promises made of a marriage and long-term relationship, and then she found out that he had been stringing her along, and she ultimately killed herself. And very tragic.
it is. It really is. And I think that the discovery of the letters is really what gives such impetus to the power of the paranormal incidences.
I agree. One other little tidbit that um, which says something as to how traumatizing her suicide was that her mother sealed the bedroom, and it was not opened for 40 years.
Yes.
And actually, after they opened it, they found the bottle of cyanide on a shelf.
Mhm.
And so it obviously had a very huge impact on her mother, who I think was about the last surviving family member at that point. And then the letters, of course, just really add to that. And but I think that kind of death, particularly when it was not fairly quick, would lend itself to activity.
I think so. I really do. I mean, and it's a trope, but beyond the trope, it is something that has been documented into antiquity of spirits with unresolved spirits, and it is tragic. I think the sadness and the tragedy that's associated with that then lends itself to the sadness, and then translating that into the fear of the haunting.
Yes. Well, and I think as well it brings up those feelings of people of, but for the grace of God go I, that any of us could end up in such a tragic situation with not too many steps,
Right.
and whether we want to admit that or not. And I think it just kind of reminds people that this is someone that on one hand had so much,
Hmm.
but had so much happen to her that she just decided, felt like this was her option. And I think it's hard for people to sort of do that hard stare into the mirror and say, what would be my breaking point?
I think that is extremely fair. And I think realistically, in many cases, certainly on a subconscious level, what we find really frightening about the ghosts is ourselves.
Very much so. Very much
Just as
so.
a quick note to give folks an idea of just how extraordinary the Allen House is. It was built in 1907.
Mhm.
It is the Gothic Victorian, 9,500 square feet. Um, the lumber used was original oak and pine that was harvested by the owner, Joe Allen's personal land. There are Grecian columns in the front. The home has a three-story octagonal turret. Um, the stained glass windows were hand blown in New Orleans. The curved window frames were handcrafted in St. Louis, and the tin ceiling above the dining room table was hand beaten into an ornate work of quote sea of little cherub faces. Now, as extraordinary as that is, I might be more haunted by the sea of little cherub faces as I was trying to eat my Cheerios.
I was just reminded of the Schifferdecker house of Mrs. Schifferdecker being not wanting to eat her breakfast with naked cherubs.
Oh, no naked cherubs allowed. Um, so it's an incredible story.
It really, I mean, it is. Um, it is the makings of a good story. And and as well as the makings of a haunting by all means with the facts of the case. But we'll have to get down there sometime, and then we can decide whether or not we think it's the most haunted house in America.
I agree. And while we are in the area, we might as well stop in at Little Rock and visit the Hornibrook House.
And I really want to go there. This house is absolutely gorgeous.
Yes, it is.
I love the pictures of it.
I do too. The home took 7 years to construct. It was completed in 1888 at a reported 1888 cost of $20,000, and it is a Queen Anne style Victorian.
Mm-hmm. But
Really,
just with lots of detail on it.
it looks like, of course, it does look haunted, okay, but it is a fantasy Victorian would be my definition for it.
Yes.
Built in a manner in which it, they clearly were not holding back the on the expenses.
No. And you had stained glass skylights, irregular plans, so that things were each part of the house unique. Over 7,200 square feet altogether. And again, in part of the pattern that we have discussed, 2 years after the home was completed, James Hornibrook died at age 49 from a stroke.
Yes.
After quite an evening, it sounds like.
Apparently, hosting a quote unquote gentleman's evening at his saloon. So it looks like he went out with a bang.
Yeah, made it back to the residence and died at the front gate.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely room for for haunting. Something that I would like to hit home on this. We've referenced several articles that talk about the dismal manner in which the next generation remembered the Gilded Age.
Mm-hmm.
But and the fact that there was even a heavy push, certainly beginning in the 1920s, for a more austere architectural style that had a number of adjectives associated with it. But something that should be noted with this Gilded Age era was we are looking at approximately 30-year period of not just extraordinary wealth, but craftsmanship that in this manner has really never been surpassed in American history.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
This is and of course I grew up in a modest ranch home that was lovely, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But the fact that in terms of modernist downsizing, the shift away is dramatic from this earlier era.
Yeah, I mean it really is. It's almost a not even a reversal, just a complete rejection.
Agreed. Yes, it is. And I would say a deliberate rejection that really created its own essentially weather pattern in the psyche of Americans.
I think so. And one point in the reference material that I find rather interesting, almost you wonder if he had some sort of premonition, that he had a death mask of Italian marble designed while on a trip to Italy um, before his death. And now,
Mhm.
was that premonition or was that just grandiose
It
spending?
could have
Which
been
would
either.
fit in with the indictment of the next generation, but it is certainly something that's a little odd.
It is. It is. And each it is the typically within the purview of each following generation to oftentimes dismiss, deride, or vilify the generation that preceded it.
Yes, yes. And the house did go through the same pattern we've described before, that it became, after it went out of the Horner family, it became part of the Arkansas Women's College. And then during the Depression in the 1940s, it stood vacant and then became a nursing home,
Yes.
and then a private residence, and then apartments. And then it was restored in the 90s to become the Empress Bed and Breakfast. So, I mean, it's just almost the stair step
It,
decline.
it is. And it also speaks, now I'm speaking deriding, but I'm just observing really the the fact that these Gilded Age fortunes rose so quickly and to such incredible heights that it doesn't appear in many cases that some of these families had a plan for perpetuity. There was simply the assumption that the family line would continue indefinitely, the money would continue indefinitely, and the fact that they were building homes that, unless they maintained their current cash flow, were not going to be able to be maintained.
The sky was the limit, I guess, was the philosophy, which is, interesting, because there had been quite a economic panic in the late 1870s. And there was another one in the right before the Spanish American War. So, um, those bubbles bursting have always been there. But
Oh,
it does seem that for a lot of these homes, it was almost as if building these things were a way of telling themselves that they were not subject to those uh, influences and trends.
I I think that's a very important observation. I mean, it is a potent um, need of humanity to establish some sort of sense of legacy, and that's what these homes were doing. They were saying, um, my accomplishments will live far beyond me.
Yes. Well, and in these cases, they have, fortunately.
Yes, not every mansion was that fortunate, but in these cases they have. And then moving into the Missouri Ozarks borderlands, we get to the Vale Mansion.
Yes. And it is very beautiful.
The mansion is a Second Empire Italianate with Gothic details, of course, and is also classified as a Victorian because of the era of which it was built, which was 1881, just in the immediate, essentially what is now the Kansas City metro.
It's in Independence, Missouri. Yes, and Independence. Jackson County is um, only one of two counties that have two courthouses, the other being Jasper County. Um, they have a county seat in Independence and a county seat in Kansas City. Um, and the Vales actually had lived in Kansas City and then moved to build the home in Independence. And it's hard to kind of wrap your head around this building. I mean, 31 rooms, 9
A
marble fireplaces, painted
a
ceilings.
a 48,000 gallon wine cellar.
Yeah, and a 6,000-gallon water tank.
Well, priorities. Let's face it.
And it is considered one of the best examples of second empire style architecture in the entire country, not just in the region.
No, and I believe it.
Mhm.
Hand carved snow white Carrara marble from Italy with onyx accents to decorate the mantle and the main parlor. The onyx pillars were said to radiate with a glow from the fire. And the mansion is constructed of hand pressed brick, partially trimmed with white limestone, and 12-foot tall, narrow windows designed to appear to soar to the sky.
And it does have that appearance in the photos of a very elongated, tall appearance that I'm sure is helped by that.
Now, the mansion was built for Colonel Harvey Merrick Vale and his wife Sophia. Um, the couple both would die in the mansion with, not surprisingly, scandal involved as well in terms of their lives.
Yes, a little different than Hornibrook, but Colonel Vale was twice accused and charged in court of defrauding the government. Both times he was found not guilty, but he was left with over $100,000 in trial expenses and a damaged reputation. And this is in the 1880s, $100,000 in trial expenses at that time. That's millions of dollars today.
Yes.
And it took its toll not only on him but on her.
Absolutely. And during this time, ultimately she was apparently diagnosed with stomach cancer and then committed suicide by overdosing on morphine.
Yes.
While her husband, Harvey Merrick Vale, was actually in Washington, D.C. on trial.
Yes, very tragic, and regardless of his actions, that would have been horrible for him to have happened.
And as though there wasn't enough in terms of the local population looking askance at him, he buries Sophia in a glass casket so he can continue to visit her until there's enough social pressure that he buries her more conventionally.
And if I recall correctly, he buried her on the estate and in a manner so that part of the casket was exposed so that you could see through the glass. And then finally, enough friends pressured him that he gave her a conventional burial. But again, this is indicative of someone that he was not coping, he was not dealing with the situation, and it tells the impact that her death had on him. And basically he became a recluse for the rest of his life in the mansion and died in the mid 1890s, which several years after her death. And then
the house, the mansion became an inn briefly and then becomes an asylum and a sanitarium and then as a base of operations for Vale Pure Water Company, until being turned into a rest home.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the apartments were the only thing that did not happen here. But you have a sanitarium.
Oh, yeah.
Which again, it factors into the hauntings, that Sophia is suspected of being seen in the home and on the grounds, seen through windows, as well as Colonel Vale himself. There's also a spirit of a young man who it is assumed that he was a patient in the sanitarium. And seen roaming the third floor, and that he had lived most of his life there.
It's now, have you had the chance to visit? I've not.
No, actually, I have not been to Vale. I have not. I want to, but I have not. I know people who have, and I've heard firsthand accounts from investigators who've investigated it, but I haven't yet.
Yeah.
So that's on our list as well. So
very much so. What sort of things were you able to pick up from the other reports?
That basically, some people seem to have more of the experience of the family members, and that it tends to be a sort of a morose haunting, kind of centered around Colonel Vale and his wife. Then I've heard accounts where people don't seem to encounter that so much, but they encounter the sanitarium patient and more shadow men and things that tend to be a little more spectral and eerie, and perhaps for some more scary. And so it does seem, over the years, it seems like when I hear people talk about it, they seem to have one or the other experience. And I'm not saying that across the board that always happens, but just from the people I've talked to, I hear one or the other, but not hearing them experiencing both sides of it.
I think that's really interesting. I really want to go.
I do too. So yeah, like I said, that's going to be on the list. So
then from Independence, we jump to the opposing side of the state, to Hannibal, Missouri, with Rockcliffe Mansion.
yes, and it's very beautiful, and literally on a cliff.
It is. I really want to visit this place. I'm relatively familiar with Hannibal, but I have not been to the mansion, and it's phenomenal. It's a colonial revival style, built between 1898 and 1900 by John J. Cruikshank Jr., who was a lumber baron.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I do know someone from Hannibal that actually Rob, who says he played on the ground, in the yard when he was a kid. But
it's really extraordinary. Of course, when you take into the economic forces into account, being a lumber baron on the Mississippi River during a time during the steamboat era, you can get an idea of just how much money could have been made by lumbering the Missouri timber.
Vast fortunes, and the house shows it.
It does. It does. So there's no John Cruikshank died in bed in 1924.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife, Mrs. Cruikshank, walked out of the doors of Rockcliffe Mansion, moved next door to live with her daughters, and at least according to legend, never went back in the house.
Yeah, again, one of those stories that the death really affected her, and but again, it says something about the meaning of the relationship to her. So another interesting just point is that Rockcliffe has connections even to Mark Twain. Mark Twain visited, of course, his hometown, but he knew the family and was a visitor there. But that gives you an idea too, just how prominent the family was.
And I do think it's interesting. We have we have the stories. George Washington slept here. In this case, we have Mark Twain haunted here.
Exactly. But Mr. Cruikshank continued to haunt it as well, which maybe contributed to Mrs. Cruikshank not staying. I don't know.
It really might have, and I think that something that's easy to overlook. We talk about hauntings being manifested when there's an enormous amount of output of emotion. We see it with battles. We see it with a lot of things. Something that, especially in this day and age, that it's easy to become derisive about, but the battle of creating these estates and this wealth. This was not. This was not old world wealth coming out of a feudal system and being perpetuated or hung on to. In many cases, these were individuals who built this monumental aristocratic wealth from the ground up.
In most of these situations were, that they came from fairly humble beginnings or moderate, but not wealthy, overly wealthy to begin with. And
that it was a battle to do what they did, to
it
create
really was.
and to create the fortunes that they had amassed. And I can't help but attach some of that emotional intensity that they must have had to have brought around them in their lives to make this happen.
I like that thought, because there does seem to be a certain amount of energy that has to culminate, almost creating your own destiny is too cliche, but creating that set of circumstances and energy to do this. And I doubt that it just dissipates into the ether with the snap of a finger.
I don't think it can. And just the we on the outside, 100 years, 120 years distant, it's easy to look at these palatial mansions and say, oh, they were super rich, everything was incredibly easy for them, must be nice, quote unquote. But the reality is that in many cases, they expended themselves. They literally burned themselves out to create this. Like this,
right.
In this sense, you could almost theorize in some of these cases that these mansions, that the mansion is actually the only embodiment left. Like they destroyed themselves to create the edifice.
Very good point. And actually there is a tale at Rockcliffe that I think illustrates that. One story is of a former caretaker of the home. And one of the stories in life was that Mr. Cruikshank would walk during the middle of the night, rambling, almost he dissipating energy from the day. He just couldn't sleep through the night. And so he would always, they say, ramble around the estate and so forth. And this caretaker said that frequently she would hear the door to the servants' entrance slam, followed by heavy boot steps coming up the stairs around 2 a.m. She believed this to be Mr. Cruikshank returning from his nightly rambles, even in the afterlife. In fact, she claimed it was such a regular occurrence that once she positioned herself at the top of the staircase to see what happened and reported that the footsteps grew louder as they came closer and a rush of air as the invisible specter passed by.
Mm. I think it's really worth considering because it gives you pause when you think about what these individuals had to do to have gotten to this point, to have created these living legacies.
Well, I think there's a certain intensity involved that again, I think this is a good example that Mr. Cruikshank continues to exhibit even now.
And well worth. I think again and again in so many different facets. This is a new facet for us, but so many facets. The ghost stories, the lore, all of it encourages us to tread respectfully on the past or with the past whenever possible. And it is, to me, it's a very humbling experience to step into these spaces that were created for a variety of means. And
I
that,
agree.
oh, go ahead.
I would just say I was agreeing with you.
With that brings us to our last mansion on the list, which is in the middle, in between Hannibal and Independence.
Yes.
Oh,
And just slightly north of the edge of the Ozark plateau.
yes, and that is the
Property.
Riverstone Mansion. I really want to visit this place.
I do too, and it's described as a New Orleans style.
And it's got the mansard roofs. It was directly associated with riverboat culture.
Built by River Captain.
And it is also is heavily tied to, it's in Howard County, heavily tied to New Orleans, and it is also a mansion with an enormous amount of family loss.
Yes. It's also the oldest, well, no, second to the oldest home that we've talked about tonight from 1864. It was built by freed slaves. And in true Ozarks borderland fashion, it was frequented by Jesse James and Bill Anderson. It belonged to the Kinney family, and the hauntings began pretty early in the 1800s, even with the Kinney family. Basically, let's see, Kinney's son Noble was said to be married to a New Orleans woman, Rosemary. She arrived at the mansion April 2nd of 1895, and on April 3rd, Noble fell over the balcony and died. After that, Rosemary went on a murder spree, and Noble's mother stayed in her son's room for the next year until she died of grief.
Mm.
I mean, it's an amazing story.
It is, and of course, it's in direct proximity to New Franklin, Missouri. It is a beautiful home. It's also the one of the more dominant photos online. Is unbelievably creepy. The mist is surrounding the house.
Yeah,
And I love it. I
I do too. Well, and Mrs. Kinney, who died in her son's room. 6 of her children died before the age of 7. Then her son dies by falling off of the balcony. And her husband died of a stroke after a midday horse ride on the property. There is a pattern here to how these gentlemen die, it seems.
Yes, it is. It is. And and a lot of factors going in. Some of them, I think, some of them very understandable, that we would think of in terms of just perhaps not caring for yourself well or being under a lot of stress, but some of it almost monumentally metaphysical in the sense that these men were creating something and they created it at their own physical sacrifice.
I think that does happen. But it's, I mean, it is pretty amazing.
And it reminds me a bit of the Shelbys and the fact that some of these individuals of great wealth in Little Dixie on the Missouri River, they had their own steamboats, and they used them for their own personal excursions.
Yes, and the Kinney family, this was just one of their properties along the river. And this was the party house. Whereas with the Shelbys, the steamboats were used as the party houses.
Understandable. Very, very incredible. And that it's extraordinary. I very, very much want to visit it. Noble's ghost is said to haunt the location, which is not surprising. And realistically, there's likely a number of hauntings with river scene.
Yeah. I have read that his mother is there too. And it's just, I mean, it reminds, it's a moment in time that it appears, and encapsulates the Civil War to the turn of the century.
It does. It's just we've got to visit.
Yeah, we do.
Of all of them right at the moment, that's the one that I want to see the most. And of course, a number of these we haven't seen because in addition to all of this, we're talking about the Borderlands. We're talking about this interesting liminal space between Ozarks into other region, whether it's the Deep South, whether it is the Great American West, whether it's the Midwest Prairie. These almost existential border spaces and these extraordinary mansions within them.
And often, if anyone's wondering, why are we talking about them? These areas had a direct impact on the Ozarks, and the Ozarks often had a direct impact on them, particularly through some of these individuals who were sort of bigger than life in their intensity and their drive. And these properties kind of illustrate that.
They do. They really do. And exist as almost living pieces of art in the memory of their creators. So out of the 10, which one do you think is the most haunted?
Oh, that's kind of hard to.
It is, especially since we've not done investigations in most cases or been in the location.
Right, but I would say that just based on just everything that I know and suspect, I think River Scene, I think Vale, the Merle House, and I almost would lean to the Hornbrook House more than the Allen House, just on face value.
Agreed. I concur with our cursory list, cursory overview, but excited to just continue the investigation process and of course begin visiting more of these locations. Some of these we have visited, and I mean,
Yes.
McPike is absolutely haunted by multiple residents, and
There you go.
that's without a doubt. And I know our Merrill House certainly is as well.
Yeah, and I have no doubt about the Bride House either. So we'll get to them all, and then we'll share it all with you as we do.
And along with that, if you know of a mansion within the Borderlands that you're interested in, or you think should be on one of our lists, let us know.
Yes, please do. And in between, don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we are going to be discussing screaming skulls, crossroads, and burial mounds. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. Remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.